When the Lord of the Rings films were being made, motion capture technology was in a precarious place. Society at large was still recovering from the fallout of Jar Jar Binks, and the Polar Express was lurking just over the horizon. Peter Jackson and the team at Weta Workshop were facing down the prospect of trying to insert a fully CGI main character into one of the most beloved stories of all time, and suffice it to say, they were quaking in their boots. But what they didn't realize is that with the help of a relatively unknown stage actor named Andy Serkis, they were about to change the motion capture and film industry forever. Motion capture, or mocap, is a pretty versatile term, but it generally means recording the movements of an object or person. Today, it is a $200 million industry, but its roots go back much further than you might think. Back in 1878, these images, called The Horse in Motion, were taken. Through the use of 24 cameras set up all in a row and auto-triggering, they were able to capture the horse in motion. This was a pretty early version of what they called chronophotography. Chrono meaning time and photography meaning photography, so time photography. And the original purpose of tests like this, of the horse in motion, was for science. Back then, they weren't even sure how things like horses ran. Some people hypothesized that there was a point in the horse's gait when all 4 feet were off the ground at once, but they couldn't be sure because they simply moved too fast, so processes like this allowed them to slow time down and analyze things a bit closer. They used this same tactic on a couple of different types of animals, but they finally realized the potential of chronophotography when they used it on people. While it wasn't their original goal, they discovered that these photos, especially of humans, ended up being amazing reference images for artists. With photographs like this, they didn't have to go with the old school method of posing a living person in a still position. Instead, they could capture what the body looked like in movement. They refined this technique, and throughout the 1880s, we can see references to chronophotographers putting reflective buttons on key points of people's bodies to allow them to track the movement better. In 1882, a French chronophotographer created a device that was able to take 12 pictures, all in 1 second, printed on one plate. It gives us these almost ghost images of someone completing an entire action. To avoid the blur that would occur because of how quickly in succession the photos were taken, they put their models in high contrast clothing, and eventually they developed a technique for putting reflective buttons and metal bands on the key points of a person's body, so that those would reflect back at the camera, the clothing would fade into the background, and you'd basically get these stick figure images of people. Although rudimentary, innovations like this are clear precursors to modern mocap technology, using reflective points on a costume to identify a body's movement. We see some other advancements in motion capture as we move into the 20th century, such as Frank and Lilith Gilbreth, who put light bulbs on the fingers of workers so that they could track their hands in a single photograph and make their movement more efficient for factory work. But the real innovation wouldn't come around in the artistic world until the invention of rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is a technique where you take live-action footage and frame by frame you trace it into your artistic style, so that when it is complete, the animated character will do the exact same movements as the live human actor. It was first pioneered by Polish-American cartoonist Max Fleischer and his brother, and they patented this rotoscoping technique in 1917. In 1919, they released the first full rotoscoped animation, which was a cute little thing of his brother in a clown suit. Fleischer would later use this technique selectively in his animation work, such as in the more complex dance scenes in the Popeye cartoon. Rotoscoping was revolutionary in a lot of ways, but especially for how quick and easy it was. When compared to traditional animation, where each frame has to be drawn out by hand, the movement of the character carefully calculated from one image to the next, rotoscoping allowed for incredibly realistic and incredibly efficient animation. This, of course, meant that a lot of people saw it as cheating. Throughout its history, people have considered rotoscoping to be the lazy man's way out, a stigma that has persisted even into modern motion capture. Still, the practice of using live action footage as a reference for animation persisted, and once that first patent wore out, it became industry standard. Even Disney took advantage of it, using it in their classics like Snow White and Alice in Wonderland. The use of rotoscoping continued throughout the 20th century, and even became the hallmark of some filmmakers like Ralph Bakshi. Bakshi used this technique to create huge sci-fi and fantasy films, such as his Wizards, and of course, his take on The Lord of the Rings. My favorite rotoscoping tidbit from his Lord of the Rings was when the actor for Aragorn tripped on his sword and fully face-planted in one of their shots, and for some reason they animated that and left it in the film. Rotoscoping seemed to flourish in the realm of fantasy and sci-fi because of its unique ability to blend reality and unreality. You could take an actor's real performance and dress it up with fantasy, adding in dwarves and wizards and magic. But rotoscoping wasn't the only form of mocap on the playing field at this time. In 1983, Tom Calvert developed an exoskeleton motion tracking system. As a doctor, he used this tracking system to monitor his patients' movement and recovery. The exoskeleton was able to give him quantifiable, recordable, and comparable data from one visit to the next. This contraption was pretty soon adopted by the animation community for the purposes of crafting mocap animation. Games were also catching on to this tech, and in the early 90s, Mortal Kombat took real-life footage of actors in costumes with weapons and digitized it to create their iconic game. The technology was advancing quickly, but it was still regarded with some wariness. This would not be helped by one of the first fully CGI characters to ever hit the big screen, the ever-infamous Jar Jar Binks from The Phantom Menace. I have gotten conflicting reports on whether or not this character was true modern motion capture, or if the actor was just a stand-in so that the animators could refer to him for placement and movement. But either way, this was one of the landmarks of CGI to real-life integration, and his reception was, well, it's not exactly controversial or daring for me to say that those movies had a lot of problems and that Jar Jar Binks was one of many. And it didn't help that Jar Jar's actor, Ahmed Best, was comparatively an unknown in the cast. He had simply been touring with the percussion group Stomp when he got pulled out to be in The Phantom Menace, and compared to ultra celebrities like Liam Neeson and Natalie Portman, he ended up being the automatic scapegoat for a lot of the fans' rage. His character was so despised that he was receiving death threats. Just by the way, if you're here, you're a fan of me and you're watching this, if you ever get so enraged by a piece of media that you feel the need to send death threats to an actor who's just trying to make money, do their job, get paid, you need to delete the internet off your phone, throw the phone into Mount Doom, and then go become a grass-touching hermit immediately. I think it would be best for all of us. It was this hostile reaction that Peter Jackson and the Weta animation team were staring down when Gollum landed on their plate. Previous attempts at adapting The Lord of the Rings had tried making Gollum just a regular guy in a loincloth, but it wasn't exactly successful. They knew that it was going to have to be a fully CGI character, and needless to say, they were scared they were gonna have another Jar Jar on their hands. They were certainly worried about it, as was New Line Cinema, their studio.
There was a huge lack of confidence in Weta's ability to do Gollum from the studio.
In order to try and prove themselves, and to keep New Line from hiring another animation studio to work on Gollum, Gollum was one of the first things that the Weta animation team started on during pre-production. They relied heavily on sculpting to find the shape and form of this character, and used people like Iggy Pop to help shape his body, and the weird artist hands of John Howe, and the extreme on-screen facial expressions of Peter Jackson himself. In the end, they had done almost 200 drawings and 100 sculptures before they found a version of Gollum that they were happy with. They roughed up a few rudimentary animation examples, and luckily that was enough to convince New Line that they might be able to create a convincing Gollum. And after this scramble, they were left trying to figure out who exactly would play this character. And at first, they were looking just for a voiceover actor, someone to go and sit in a booth for 3 weeks, record all the lines, and that was that. And with this in mind, they approached the London-based stage actor, Andy Serkis. And at first, Serkis was not impressed. In fact, he thought the role would be rather boring. There were so many incredible roles in the script, so many great people they could have had him audition for, but this was just gonna be 3 weeks sitting in a booth doing a weird voice. He was considering declining it, but then his wife, who was a really big fan of the books, told him just to read them before he makes his decision. Andy Serkis did read the books, and he ended up falling in love with the complexity of Gollum's character. He sent Peter Jackson and his team an audition tape, and they pretty much cast him right there and then. The voice itself, which was based off of the sound of his cats hacking up hairballs, was the perfect mix between this, goofy little goblin-like fantasy character and the truly raw, rasping agony of the character. What really drew them in, though, was the pure physicality of Serkis's performance. In order to produce the voice, to produce this extreme emotion, he had to do the full character, including the hunched posture, the facial contortions. Peter Jackson realized that they didn't just need him to be the character's voice, they needed him as the motivating energy behind the entire character. What was originally supposed to be just 3 weeks of work in a voiceover booth somewhere quickly ballooned when they flew Andy Serkis over to New Zealand and began putting him in shots. On his very first day on set, Serkis was put into a flesh-colored morph suit with a full mask, which was affectionately called the Gimp suit, and was popped into the machine of production with little to no explanation or introduction. And his original intended goal was to basically be a rehearsal partner for Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, so that they could rehearse the Frodo, Sam, Gollum scenes with somebody physically there, as well as doing the voice. And Serkis took to this somewhat ridiculous role like a duck to water. He had been rock climbing for a while, and so based off of a sketch made by John Howe, he created the now iconic creeping, crawling posture of Gollum, climbing down cliff faces and slinking through crevices. They recorded the rehearsals that he did with the other actors, maybe to use him as an animation reference or something, but the second that the cameras were rolling for the real shot, he would be pulled out and Sam and Frodo would be acting to an empty space. Since no one really understood what exactly was the job of this strange gimp suit wearing man, nobody really gave him any respect. He was just a voice actor who was taking everything a little bit too seriously. However, Serkis didn't let that discourage him. Instead, it drove him to try and earn his place, to push himself harder and harder, throwing himself around the set, destroying his gimp suit, tearing up his hands and knees on the rocks, and practically destroying his voice, doing the Gollum voice for hours on hours at a time. They even had to create special Gollum juice that had a bunch of throat-coating ingredients so that he wouldn't totally lose his voice. But in the end, this wild dedication did pay off.
Andy totally earned his right to be Gollum the hard way, because he was coming into a situation where none of us really thought we needed Andy, but we gradually came to realize we couldn't do without him.
When the time came to finish up the animation, they realized that the original version of Gollum that they had created, years before Andy Serkis was even considered for the role, they realized that it didn't look enough like him. They had already given the audience a glimpse of Gollum in the Fellowship of the Ring, but when he was going to be seen fully in the light of day, they realized that there wasn't enough of Andy Serkis in the character. The need for this change was cemented by the fact that Serkis was cast in the opening scene of The Return of the King to play the younger Hobbit version of Gollum. It only made sense then that Gollum must look like a decayed version of Andy Serkis's face. It would be him if he had been Gollumified. They had to totally rebuild the model into a version that looked just enough like Andy Serkis while still looking like Gollum, and only once that was done could they begin reanimating the entirety of the Two Towers. And they only had about 2.5 months to complete that job. Thus, let me reintroduce our good old friend, motion capture. They put Andy Serkis back in a morph suit, this time with reflective dots. This allowed the surrounding cameras to track the points of his movement, and in real time, he could manipulate a 3D model of Gollum. And although they were in a bit of a time crunch, this was truly exciting. Now, Gollum wasn't just going to be an innovative, fully CGI character. Through the use of very direct performance referencing and now mocap, they were pioneering a new technique of actor integration into CG animation. They were making history. Still, not everybody on the animation team was totally on board for the integration of this new mocap tech. Some of them were still proponents of the more traditional keyframe animation technique, where the animators would go through frame by frame and manipulate the character's actions. And you know what? They had a point. While mocap was great for efficiency and for speed, it wasn't able to record any finer details like hand and finger movement or any facial expressions at all. Besides, Andy Serkis is a fully grown man, and Gollum is a malnourished little hobbit. Andy Serkis, no matter how great his performance is, simply could not embody the muscle and agility of a character like Gollum. And yet, mocap was so much more efficient, and on top of that, it captured nuances in human movement that keyframe struggled with. For example, when your arm moves, it's not just your arm moving, the rest of your body moves and shifts in very subtle and nuanced ways. Mocap was undoubtedly more realistic in that regard. Besides, in this argument between keyframe and mocap, there was a lot of pride involved. They all knew that Gollum was going to be a landmark character in the world of CG animation, and both the keyframe animators and the mocap animators wanted to be able to take the credit for it. In the end, Weta was able to come to a compromise and meld the two techniques together. They used the combined power of Serkis's performance and the expertise of animators to create a character that was both human and inhuman, energetic, but still grounded. And when it came to this animation, they found themselves not relying on the final takes, but on these so-called rehearsal shots, the ones that still had Andy Serkis in them, creepy little gimp suit and all. They found that these rehearsal performances were almost always more energetic, and that the physical contact between the actors and the emotional contact between the actors was incredibly important. They had to develop a technique which they called roto-animation, in which they would take every frame and paint Andy Serkis out, only to superimpose an Andy Serkis-inspired Gollum on top. But don't let the beauty of Andy Serkis's performance downplay the sheer talent of the animators. Although they had Serkis's face for reference, many of the most important details, such as his eyes, had to be created entirely through animation. I think one of the most beautiful examples of this is Gollum's argument with himself in The Two Towers. This was a scene that was inserted later on, and let's be honest, it's mostly there to flex the skill of Andy Serkis and the animators. Through comparison videos like this, which show the performance and the animation side by side, you can really see just how much Andy Serkis brought the performance to life and how much the animators perfected it. I think that Gollum works so well as an actor-inspired animated CGI character because of who he is. Gollum treads this very treacherous line between the sympathetic and the monstrous, between the human and the inhuman. It's very fitting that he sits somewhere on the edges of the uncanny valley, both alien and quite familiar. In the Two Towers book, Gollum comes up upon Frodo and Sam, who are asleep, and Sam is cradling Frodo's head in his lap. And we get to see Gollum experience a very interesting moment. Gollum looked at them. A strange expression passed over his lean, hungry face. The gleam faded from his eyes, and they went dim and gray, old and tired. A spasm of pain seemed to twist him, and he turned away, peering back up towards the pass, shaking his head as if engaged in some interior debate. Then he came back, and slowly putting out a trembling hand, very cautiously he touched Frodo's knee, but almost the touch was a caress. For a fleeting moment, could one of the sleepers have seen him, they would have thought that they beheld an old, weary hobbit, shrunken by the years that had carried him far beyond his time, beyond friends and kin and the fields and streams of youth, an old, starved, pitiable thing. The hobbits wake, and Sam lashes out, shattering this glimpse at humanity. Gollum withdrew himself, and a green glint flickered under his heavy lids. Almost spider-like he looked now, crouched back on his bent limbs with his protruding eyes. The fleeting moment had passed, beyond recall. Gollum's entire character is informed by a tension between humanity and inhumanity. He wants so desperately to touch and to be touched, but that sort of intimacy is long gone. He wants to be accepted, but anytime he gets close to anyone, he lashes out for fear that he never will be. I truly don't think that the film CGI character would have been what it is if it didn't have a real person behind it. Someone struggling for connection and recognition and respect behind all those hours of skillful animation. Luckily, the fate of Andy Serkis was much more positive than that of Gollum. The character was a smash hit with audiences and is still regarded as one of the best examples of mocap tech in action. People still do impressions of Andy Serkis's Gollum voice, and even if the animation wasn't perfect, it still holds up better than almost every one of its contemporaries. The success and the praise for a fully CG character like Gollum had massive ramifications on the film industry. For example, in 2009, James Cameron finally decided that tech had advanced enough for him to create his Blue People Avatar movie. The Avatar film and its recent sequel rely heavily on what they call performance capture, rather than motion capture. They used cameras to record the intricacies of an actor's facial performance as well as their physical performance, and they used this information to create stunning sci-fi visuals. Some kind of motion capture can be found in almost every one of the 10 top-grossing films, and the technology has flourished in fields like video games. Andy Serkis rode the wave of the Lord of the Rings success and has become a massive figure in the growing mocap industry. He's played apes in King Kong and in the new Planet of the Apes films. He's played big bads in Star Wars films, and has even opened his own motion capture production studio called Imaginarium. Unfortunately, the stigmas that have chased this art form since its earliest days do still persist. Despite its prominence and how common it is in the industry now, no actor has ever been nominated for an Oscar based solely on mocap performance. Despite the fact that there is a whole separate category for animation, and that some actors who are wearing such heavy prosthetics that they're unrecognizable have won Oscars, the actors behind some of the most iconic characters of this era don't see recognition. Fortunately, prominent figures like Andy Serkis have continued to advocate for the legitimacy of this art form, and hopefully we will start to see some changes soon. Motion capture and the art that it can produce is unprecedented. Nowadays, we have the ability to craft more spectacular, astonishing works of art than we ever have before. And to me, it makes sense that The Lord of the Rings was one of this art form's pioneers. Since it was first published in 1954, The Lord of the Rings has stretched and defined the limits of fantasy and fairy tale storytelling. It's shown us what our imaginations are capable of. And the revolutionary work done for the character of Gollum proves that its ability to inspire and to drive creativity isn't going anywhere. I would love to hear what your favorite uses of mocap have been over the last couple of years. I've gotta admit, as someone that's pretty into puppets and practical effects, I'd love to see a little bit more integration of more practical forms of this, but I gotta admit, the capabilities of mocap are almost limitless. I think in a perfect world, we would start to see more integration of CG with practical effects, because that is where, like in The Lord of the Rings, that's where the magic happens, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. It's also going to be interesting to see how this new Lord of the Rings movie with Andy Serkis at the helm is going to pan out. I'll probably make a full video exploring this whole situation once we have more information, but we don't really have a whole lot now. Here's the thing. I trust Andy Serkis's creative vision for the most part, and so I'm left believing that this could do a lot of good things, and that it could also do a lot of bad things. We just don't know a lot yet, but I'm not necessarily dreading it, but I don't know if I'd say I'm optimistic. If you want to keep talking to me about this stuff, go ahead and check out my Patreon and my patron-only Discord, which is linked in the description. Give this video a like if you learned something, because it really helps me out in the great algorithm, and go ahead and subscribe if you want to hear me talk about the things I like to talk about every single week. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.